right, so we are back with the second part of our nervous system lesson. If you missed the first part, if you missed up through slide 20, you can go back and watch the first part of the lesson. So we're going to pick up here on slide 21 of your notes with the cerebrum of the brain. So it's the largest part of the human brain, and if you've heard that your brain has lobes, those lobes are part of the cerebrum portion of our brains. The outer layer is gray matter, and it's called the cerebral cortex, made of those four lobes. It's mainly the dendrites and cell bodies of neurons. The interior of the cerebrum is mainly white matter, so it's nerve fibers arranged in bundles that we call tracts that are covered with myelin. Functions of the cerebrum include mental processes of all types, including different sensations, consciousness, memories, and voluntary control of our movements. So we can actually break the lobes of our brain into different functions that they're going to help control in our bodies. So first we have the frontal lobe. It's the area that we would see highlighted in blue right here. Just to kind of give you perspective, this would be the back of your head. This would be the front of your head. So like your forehead would be right in front of this area. The frontal lobe is going to be related to controlling personality, behavior, and emotions, judgment, planning, and problem solving, speech, so both speaking and writing, body movement. There's an area called the motor strip, and then intelligence, concentration, and self-awareness. That's actually the last part of the brain to become like fully matured. And that usually doesn't happen until you're in your early 20s. So that's why for you guys as teenagers tend to have, maybe poor judgment or not good planning skills or problem solving skills. And that gets better as we get older. If we move to the parietal lobe next, that's highlighted in yellow here. I'm actually going to go clockwise from the frontal lobe just because of where we're looking at on the brain. So the parietal lobe is going to help to interpret language and words, sense of touch, pain, and temperature. There's a sensory strip area of the parietal lobe. It's going to interpret signals from vision, hearing, motor, sensory, and memory. And it also helps with your spatial and visual perception. Next, I'm going to go to the temporal lobe, which is right here in green. It helps with understanding language, memory, hearing, because if you think of that, your ears would be like right here on the sides of your head, as well as sequencing and organization. And then back here, your occipital lobe is responsible for interpreting vision, so color and light. The reason why we see things is because light enters our eyes, travels through the optic nerve, crosses over and comes to the occipital lobe at the back of our cerebrum. There are some deep structures of the brain. Okay, we have the hypothalamus gland. So that means that, again, deep, if you think of deep versus superficial, the directional terms we went over at the beginning of the year, these would be like internal structures of the brain. So you have the hypothalamus gland, or just hypothalamus, which helps to, one, control our body temperature, but it helps with our hunger, thirst, sleep, and sexual response, blood pressure, emotions, and the secretion of hormones. It's responsible for producing some hormones that are stored in our pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is known as like the master gland of our endocrine system because it controls other endocrine glands in our body, and it produces many hormones itself, as well as storing the hormones that your hypothalamus makes. Next, we have the pineal gland, which secretes a hormone called melatonin, and melatonin is responsible for regulating your internal clock or circadian rhythms and your like day-night kind of cycle. The thalamus is kind of a relay station for almost all the information that comes and goes to the cortex of your cerebrum. Next, we have the limbic system, which includes the hypothalamus that we already mentioned, as well as the amygdala, which controls your emotional reactions to things, and the hippocampus, which helps with memory. Finally, we have the corpus callosum that helps the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum communicate. So if we look here, okay, we can see some of these structures. So we would have The amygdala would be here, hypothalamus is here, pituitary gland, the pineal gland is this little part right here, thalamus. Okay, so all of, just so you can kind of see where those are located. The brain stem we can see here, just so you can see where they relate. So here would be the brain stem, cerebellum, cerebrum. Corpus callosum is here. It's kind of like a weird C shape, but it's a C shape. So if you remember that for corpus callosum, is shaped like a C. We also have like hypothalamus is here, pituitary gland. So just is to let you see kind of where things are located in relation to each other within your brain. So since we mentioned circadian rhythm, we'll go through that now just real quick. So if you kind of feel like awake or tired at like the same times every day, that's because of your circadian rhythm. So it's basically a 24-hour internal clock that's kind of running in the background of your brain, and it cycles between sleepiness and alertness at kind of fairly regular intervals, and it's also known as your sleep-wake cycle. For the majority of adults, the biggest drop in energy happens in the middle of the night, usually between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., usually when they're fast asleep. It's usually I lay awake in bed until then, and then I feel tired. And then just after lunchtime, okay, as well. So around 1 to 3 p.m., when they usually want kind of a post-lunch nap. Those times can be different if you naturally are kind of like a night owl versus a morning person. You also won't feel the dips and rises in your circadian rhythm if you're kind of caught up on sleep, or if you can't actually catch up on sleep. Once you lose sleep, you lose it. If you're getting regular amounts of sleep every night, like enough sleep every night. But it's when you are sleep deprived, you're not getting enough sleep for a long period of time, that you're going to notice like larger swings, like you feel much more tired or much more alert. Part of the hypothalamus, which we already mentioned, does help control your circadian rhythm, but there are outside factors like light and dark outside that also impact it. So when it's dark out, your eyes are interpreting like less light, letting you know it's dark outside, and they send a signal to your hypothalamus that, all right, it's getting dark out, it's time to start making our body feel tired at this point. So your brain, because of that, sends a signal to your brain, elsewhere in your brain, to release melatonin. So it gets your pineal gland to release that hormone, melatonin, that makes your body tired. So that is why typically your circadian rhythm coincides with the cycle of daytime and nighttime. So when it's light out versus when it's dark out. So people that work shift work, and they're working like overnight when they're awake overnight and trying to sleep during the day. That's why it's difficult for people to stay awake all night and then sleep during the day when it's light out. Your circadian rhythm does work best when you have regular sleep habits, like going to bed at the same time every night, waking up at the same time every morning, including on weekends, which, you know, you're like me and during the week you get up at 5 a.m. There's no way I want to get up at 5 a.m. on a Saturday or a Sunday, or if we have a day off. But that impacts then my circadian rhythm. So when things get in the way, you could have jet lag from traveling, daylight savings time, like when we just recently sprang ahead and we lost an hour in the morning. It took you probably a few days before you felt like those times were normal again. You could be watching like a sporting event on TV that keeps you up really late. So from all of these kinds of things, it's possible to actually disrupt your circadian rhythm, and that can kind of make you feel just thrown off and make it harder for you to pay attention in school if you're not getting enough sleep. Okay, so we will have something later on where you'll be able to look at sleep, okay, if that's something that interests you. But if we look here at inside the teenage brain, teenagers are more prone to high-risk behavior, and there's like a biological reason for that. So if you're looking here, the prefrontal cortex, which includes planning and reasoning, that grows until you're 25. So in adults, it's fully developed, but in teens, that causes them to be immature and prone to more high-risk behaviors that could cause them danger. The amygdala, again, emotional responses to things, passion, impulses, fear. Adults rely less on this because their prefrontal cortex is more developed. But in teens, they're more impulsive because they're relying on the amygdala. In the parietal lobe, it's responsible for touch, sight, and language, and that continues to grow until our early 20s. So in adults, it's fully developed, but in teenagers, it causes them to not process information effectively. Next, we have the ventral striatum. It's the reward center, and that's not fully developed in teens. So teens tend to be more excited by the potential of a reward rather than a possible consequence. And then finally, we see the hippocampus, which is, responsible for memory and learning. That is growing in teens. In adults, it's fully functional, and we actually lose neurons there as we age. So there's kind of a tremendous learning curve during your teen years because of rapidly growing neurons in that area of the brain. Okay, so we're going to quick look at some brain myths before we go on to talking about the spinal cord. So here we have some brain myths, and I'd like you to try to think about if they are fact or if they're fiction. So I'll read through them. You can try to answer them. So the first one is you only use 10% of your brain. So you can say if you think that's true or false. Number 2, a person can either be left-brained or right-brained. So that means that you prefer, not that you consciously decide, but you prefer using one side of your brain versus the other. Number 3, each person's brain has a set learning style. So that means you can learn one way. And number 4, some people are able to multitask very well. Okay. So for number 1, you only use 10% of your brain. That is false. You actually use 100% of your brain. The next one, a person can either be right-brained or left-brained, or left-brained or right-brained is what it said. And that is false as well. You actually use both sides of your brain equally. Next, each person's brain has a set learning style. False again, because you're actually able to learn in all ways. You may prefer learning in a certain way, like maybe you prefer learning by doing something. Oops, sorry. Here's my answer now for the last one because I was trying to drag it from off of the screen. So here we have the answer to the last one. Oh my goodness. All right. So you can learn in all learning styles. And then the last one, some people are able to multitask very well. That is false. You actually cannot multitask, meaning you're doing more than one thing at a time. You don't consciously realize it, but you're splitting your attention. You're going back and forth between those two tasks, so you can't 100% focus on more than one thing at a time. You may be more efficient at switching back and forth between two different tasks at the same, trying to do them at the same time, but you're not actually doing two things at once. All right, so we move on to the spinal cord now. The spinal cord it's going to have columns of white matter. So it's composed of bundles of myelinated nerve fibers that form the outer portion of the core of the spinal cord, which kind of has an H shape to it. And those bundles of axons, again, are called tracts. The interior then is made of gray matter, made up of mostly the dendrites and cell bodies of the neurons. And the spinal cord actually gives us a two-way conduction path, both ascending and descending, to send signals up towards the brain or away from the brain. The spinal cord functions as a primary center for all of our spinal cord reflexes, such as pulling your hand away from a hot object. There's also sensory tracts that conduct impulses up to the brain, and motor tracts that send impulses away from the brain down the spinal cord. So we look at coverings for both the brain and the spinal cord. They are such important organs. So we have specialized kind of protective features for them. So as far as coverings, we have cranial bones, which will be our skull and our vertebrae. And then there are cerebral meninges and spinal meninges, which is a layer of actually 3 membranes. If you've ever heard of meningitis, that's an infection of the covering of the brain or the spinal cord. There are fluid-filled spaces. So we have subarachnoid spaces of the meninges. We have the central canal inside of our spinal cord, and we have ventricles or chambers inside of our brain. There's also fluid that offers protection called cerebrospinal fluid. It helps to cushion and also provides immune protection for our brain and spinal cord. So here we have meningitis. Okay. There are different types of meningitis. There's bacterial meningitis and viral meningitis that are more common. And then there's also fungal meningitis, which is really hard to treat. The symptoms of meningitis include really intense headaches and fever, like really high fevers. You might be sensitive to light and have muscular rigidity. So like your muscles are stiff. Leading possibly into convulsions, delirium, and possibly death. So there are meningococcal vaccines that you can get to help, protect you and prevent you from getting meningitis. Usually if people are going away to college, it's a requirement they get the meningitis vaccine before they go away to school because it can spread easily from person to person. When people are living together in dorms, it's possible that there would be a meningitis outbreak on a campus at a college. All right, so moving away from the central nervous system and going on to the peripheral nervous system. So once again, our peripheral nervous system is all of our nerves. We have cranial nerves as well as spinal nerves, and then you have other nerves in addition to that. So with cranial nerves, we have 12 pairs. Those 12 pairs are attached to the underside of our brain, and they're going to be responsible for connecting our brain with the neck and structures in our thorax and abdomen. For our spinal nerves, we have 31 pairs. The spinal nerves contain the dendrites of our sensory neurons and the axons of motor neurons so that they can kind of work together. They're going to conduct impulses that are necessary for sensations and voluntary movements. Once our spinal nerves exit the vertebral column, they're going to split, combine, and split again, forming what we call a plexus. And there are 4 of those. So we would have your cranial or cervical nerves, thoracic nerves, lumbar nerves, and sacral nerves. Okay, so they'd be connected inside the spinal column, which are your bones there, to the spinal cord. And then they leave through kind of spaces in between the vertebrae. So if we look now kind of at the functioning of our peripheral nervous system, we can kind of categorize that into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So for the somatic nervous system, it's going to be voluntary control of our skeletal muscles as well as involuntary reflexes. Those are controlled by our somatic nervous system. Our autonomic nervous system, or it's also referred to as our visceral nervous system, it is responsible for controlling unconscious bodily functions, such as our heartbeat, our breathing rate, digestion. And there's 2 divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. With that, the sympathetic nervous system is kind of like the emergency response system of our body. So if you are in like a stressful situation, you're going to have changes happening in your body, like increased heart rate, increased breathing rate. Your digestion rate will be slowed down because that's not important in a stressful situation. So any kind of changes that are induced or caused by sympathetic control, we call the fight or flight response. So in a stressful situation, you're making determinations about, should you stay and deal with that situation or should you get yourself the heck out of there? For the parasympathetic nervous system, this is like our everyday normal conditions of functioning. So it's referred to as rest and digest. So no stress going on as far as you like surviving and getting away from, some crazy situation. So here we can just see sympathetic versus parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system response is going to be fight or flight. So you would be, if you think of stress for sympathetic, and if you're at peace, you're resting, right? Rest and digest is parasympathetic. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our nervous system notes. You can make sure you submit your notes for me. If you didn't get the first part of the notes, there is a video on that as well.